Podcast. I want to thank you for joining us this evening. Come on into this space. We want to thank you for inviting us into your living rooms, into your houses, into your bedrooms, wherever you are this evening. We want to thank you for joining us for this special broadcast. My name is Devin Jerome Crawford. I'm the staff director of the William Monroe Trotter Collaborative for Social Justice, and this is a new and unique offering from the Trotter Collaborative. Again, the name of this podcast is the Avant Guardian Podcast, and we have a particular mission here, that is to merge the power of narrative and storytelling to advance the practice of social justice advocacy and progressive public policy. We want to take the stories of some of the advocates and freedom fighters across this nation from history and in our contemporary context and lift them up so as to empower everyone that comes into contact with this podcast and with the work of the Trotter Collaborative. And to join us this evening to talk about a particular and fascinating story, a freedom fighter and social justice advocate are none other than Professors Kerri Greenidge and Professor Cornell William Brooks. I want to thank them for joining us this evening. Professor Kerri Greenidge is the director of the American Studies program at Tufts University. She received her doctorate in American Studies from Boston University, where her specialty included African American history, American political history, and African American and African diasporic literature. Her research explores the role of African American literature in the creation of radical Black political consciousness, and particularly as it relates to local elections and democratic populism during the Progressive Era. She is the author of Boston Abolitionist, and particularly the book that we'll discuss this evening, Black Radical, The Life and Times of William Monroe Trotter. We are so grateful and thankful to have Dr. Greenidge on this inaugural podcast. And joining her this evening is none other than Professor Cornell William Brooks. Professor Brooks is the professor of practice of the public leadership and social justice at the Harvard Kennedy School. He is the founding director of the William Monroe Trotter Collaborative for Social Justice at the Harvard Kennedy School. He is also a visiting professor of the practice of prophetic religion and public leadership at Harvard Divinity School. Many of you may know him as the former president and CEO of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, where he served with distinction. He is also a civil rights attorney and an ordained minister, a fourth generation AME minister, one of the oldest denominations in African-American denominations in our country. Prior to leading the NAACP, Professor Brooks was the president and CEO of the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, where he led the passage of pioneering criminal justice reform and housing legislation, 6 bills in less than 5 years. Professor Brooks holds a JD from the Yale Law School, where he was a senior editor of the Yale Law Review and a member of the Yale Law and Policy Review. He also holds a Master of Divinity from Boston University's School of Theology, where he was the Martin Luther King Jr. Scholar, and also earned the Bachelor of Arts from Jackson State University. Now, for all of you who are joining us this evening, before we pass the mic to our co-discussants this evening, I have 2 particular asks of you. Number 1, I'd ask that you follow the Trotter Collaborative on your social media accounts. That's right, go ahead and share this information. We want to get this word out. Share this with your friends, share this with your family, share this with your colleagues. This is going to be a rich discussion on a wonderful and radical pioneer in freedom movements in this country. So share this on share this on your social media. Join us on our social media platforms at Harvard_Trotter on Twitter, Instagram, and we are the William Monroe Trotter Collaborative for Social Justice on Facebook. And secondly, ask your questions. This is going to be a forum where we want to hear from the people. So at the end of the conversation, we want you to ask your questions in the Q&A function here on the Zoom platform, or if you're following us on Facebook, ask your questions in the chat, and we'd love to engage you and hope that we're able to get to as many questions as possible. So at this time, I'd like to pass the mic, metaphorically, to Professor Brooks and Dr. Greenidge.
Well, first of all, let me just say thank you to my colleague, Devin Crawford, the entire team, and to say to everyone listening and watching this podcast, this inaugural edition of the Avant Guardian Podcast. This podcast is being launched on the 147th birthday of a pioneer, a social justice titan by the name of William Monroe Trotter. It is being shared via the William Monroe Trotter Collaborative for Social Justice here at the Harvard Kennedy School and based in the Center for Public Leadership. We are absolutely delighted. Let me say that again. Delighted to have Professor Kerri Greenidge here to discuss an extraordinarily exciting, inspiring, informative book on someone that if you don't know, you should know. And by the time you get to the end of this podcast, you'll know more about. That would be William Monroe Trotter. And so what I'd like to do is just to pose a threshold question to the professor. You note in your book that William Monroe Trotter is virtually unknown across the country. And I dare say, as a professor at Harvard, virtually unknown at Harvard. Yes. And you describe him as both a Black radical and an unlikely hero. So for all of our listeners and viewers, can you just introduce William Monroe Trotter on the 147th anniversary of his birth to the country?
Well, thank you very much for having me, and thank you for your question. So William Monroe Trotter was actually born April 7th, 1872. He was the son of both a formerly enslaved African-American man named James Monroe Trotter, but James Monroe Trotter was also a veteran of the 55th Massachusetts Regiment and became one of only a handful of Black lieutenants in the Union Army. So that was Monroe's father. His mother was Virginia Isaacs Trotter, who was the daughter of descendants of enslaved people in Charlottesville, Virginia. And her parents, her father, Tucker Isaacs, actually spent years traveling over the mountains from Virginia into Ohio to free members of their family. So William Monroe Trotter was born from this very promising background, and I talk about in the book of his father, who was brought up in this radical Black abolitionist tradition, and his mother, who was raised within that tradition. So he was born in 1872 in Chillicothe, Ohio. His father at that time was a member of the Black upper class here in Boston, where James Monroe Trotter was an agent in the post office in Boston. And so he grew up in this very middle class Black home in Hyde Park, Massachusetts, which at the time was considered a country town outside of Boston, as a neighborhood within Boston. And he graduated from Harvard in 1895, Phi Beta Kappa, and was supposed to be a golden child who entered this Black bourgeoisie late 1950s. Got offers to teach in Washington, D.C., and had even dreams of becoming a minister at one point. And then from his Harvard graduation until he founded The Guardian, he was struck by the ways in which the reaction against Reconstruction in the South produced a backlash against the 14th and 15th Amendment and led to disfranchisement, segregation, and a rise in racial violence across the South. And so he saw it as his duty in 1901 to create a platform, the Guardian newspaper. It appeared every week on a Saturday, to, as he said, hold a mirror up to nature. And basically what he meant by that, and that was a Shakespeare quote, he basically meant that the duty of the Black press at the time was to expose the lie at the heart of kind of the American racial idea at the time, which was basically that slavery had ended, Reconstruction was a mistake, and African Americans were, quote unquote, a degraded race. These are the words of Theodore Roosevelt, President of the United States, and therefore time and education were what would lead to civil rights that were promised in radical Reconstruction. So he lived until 1934, and throughout his life, He produced the Guardian newspaper with help, as I talk about in his book, from his sisters and his wife. And in that, he challenged everything from the leading racial conservatism of Booker T. Washington, the racial politics of President Roosevelt and President Taft. He confronted President Woodrow Wilson, who segregated the United States government in 1912 and 1913, and also had a veer towards Black radicalism in the 1920s, in which he engaged with younger activists, people like Cyril V. Briggs, people like Hugh Harrison, in trying to get African-American people, as he said, to discover their power within themselves to combat for racial justice.
So you summarize hundreds of pages in seconds, okay? But since we're at Harvard, and we're speaking to a great many students who are at Harvard, yes, but also Howard, also Hampton, Morehouse, Spelman, Jackson State, Tennessee State, HBCUs, as well as PWIs across the country. And we have a generation of students who find themselves literally in the midst of generationally unprecedented levels of activism around the country. Here we have this figure who, while a student, was engaged in protests, engaged in his life's work. So can you talk about his years at Harvard, right? He's at Harvard, Du Bois is there. He might be a little more popular than Du Bois, but talk a little bit about his student days.
Oh, thank you for the question. So Trotter arrived at Harvard in the fall of 1891. This was just 4 years before Plessy versus Ferguson, which sanctioned segregation. And when he arrived at Harvard, he had been brought up in a household where he was taught to have pride in the fact that he was a Black man. And entering Harvard in 1891, he didn't approach Harvard as a place where he didn't belong. And Du Bois would say of him that Trotter was in Harvard and of Harvard, whereas Du Bois would say about himself that he was in Harvard but not of it, that he felt kind of alienated. And Trotter really took to Harvard, and particularly the academics at Harvard. He also took to the fact that there was a very small but very vibrant group of Black students who were on Harvard's campus, whether they were undergraduates, whether they were in the law school, whether they were sort of just passing through and attended for like a year and then left. And so some of these people he found strength in and really tried to become involved in politics in Cambridge, Massachusetts. His first protest was in 1893, where he helped organize a shift in Massachusetts civil rights law. One of his friends at Harvard was a law student named William Henry Lewis, who was from Virginia. And Lewis was graduating from Harvard the law school in 1893, went to get his hair cut in Cambridge and was refused service. And this at the time was—
Brother trying to get a haircut.
You're trying to get a haircut, yeah, in Cambridge, Massachusetts,
That's right.
in 1893, and William Henry Lewis was denied that. And the argument on behalf of the shop's owner was that the laws in Massachusetts, while prohibiting public desegregation, didn't specifically talk about barbershops. And so Trotter, William Henry Lewis, and other Black students at Harvard and also at Amherst and other predominantly white institutions in the area basically petitioned the state legislature and got the civil rights law in Massachusetts strengthened through their efforts. So that was his first introduction.
And did they take this up to the governor as students?
Yes, they did. They confronted the governor. The governor at the time was himself a Harvard graduate, Governor Russell. And the governor at the time was somebody who, like many people back then, and I think as now, are lulled into this false sense that racism and racial prescription, as was called in Trotter's day, were things of the past, right? So this governor was from Cambridge, gone to Harvard, really assumed that the country had fought a civil war, and so why would there possibly be anything wrong after slavery ended? And so with Trotter, the governor pushed the legislature to look into revising the state laws. And so that's an example of Trotter's early activism. And really, if you're looking at Harvard, if you're looking at his background as a student, and one of the things I also tell my students is that using the resources that were at his disposal at the time, to strike a blow against racial segregation and racial injustice. When he left Harvard, he would become critical of himself as a young person. But when he was at Harvard, he would definitely use the resources that he had at his disposal, particularly this sort of Black cohort of students who were knew the law and knew particularly the laws of the 14th Amendment to fight for protections.
And, you know, one thing that struck me about his time in college was both how radical he was, but also how traditional. Meaning being deeply religious, leading a temperance movement, a kind of anti-drug movement of its day, but also challenging the governor of the state of Massachusetts. Right? How do you reconcile like this, you know, this traditionalism, but also this radicalism? And then you use this wonderful phrase, self-protective coloration.
Yes. Well, self-protective coloration, that's actually a Du Bois quote. Du Bois is saying, self-protective coloration at Harvard, meaning that if you were a student at Harvard or Yale or Brown or Amherst or the women's college, any of the women's colleges in the area at the time, and you were Black, there was this idea that you stuck to the Black community, albeit very small, that you found. And you found protection and solace and intellectual discussion with Black people who were not necessarily at Harvard or Yale or Brown, but were in the surrounding communities around that. And so Trotter found, always throughout his life, found his most challenging, most intellectually engaging conversations with Black people who surrounded him, whether they were people who were at Yale or at Harvard, or they were not. They were the people who lived in the cities and towns around that area. But in terms of his like Victorian sensibilities, I say in the book that, you know, he was born in 1872. Both of his parents were very religious. He himself grew up and for a time entertained the thought of becoming a minister, but his father told him not to do so because he would be reduced to being a minister in a segregated system. And so I would say that it's sort of the characteristic of an activist, right? That many of our activists, people who are involved in social justice presently, often have multiple sides to them, right? They often are human beings who on one hand might seem conservative or might have certain tastes, but at their heart, at their core, they are people who care about the, you know, transnational freedom struggle for racial equality.
So, you know, related to that, another thing that struck me about the book is the fact that The Guardian described, certainly by its readers, as the best race newspaper in the country.
Yes.
This is embraced by, you know, not only the highbrow Du Boisian types, but grassroots real folk who love this paper. So how does a to the manner born Black bourgeoisie, a young man who grew up with tennis lessons and music, how does he become like the spokesperson for the man and woman person on the street?
So Trotter, and as I point out in the book, was somebody, and I think one of the ideas I'm trying to convey in the book is that it is possible to be somebody who comes from that quote unquote well-heeled background, and
creme de la creme brulee.
Creme brulee, right? The black talented 10th, as Du Bois would call it, of the time, and have this connection to the black public and the Black working class, and what he referred to, and many of his contemporaries referred to, as the genteel poor, right? He understood that from the very beginning, and this was, you know, his parents doing, that not all African descended people were going to be at Harvard or Howard or any of the number of universities, but that did not mean they were not politically conscious and activist people. And Trotter fundamentally believed that those people needed to just realize the power of themselves as a unit, as working people in the 1890s through the 1930s when Trotter died, that community, the Black community itself, had within it what it knew it wanted for itself. And so it did not need to rely on as he started to call them, you know, the traitors of the Negro race, right? People, he would say, who were
Benedict Arnolds.
yes, the Benedict Arnolds of the Negro race, as he called them, right? People who had basically gone to universities, were members of the talented 10th, and criticized the life of everyday Black people. And Trotter would never do that, right? He was somebody who fundamentally believed that that community was the community that was going to lead to liberation.
So in reading your book, I'm thinking about viralized social justice campaigns, right? So we have, you know, these viralized social justice campaigns to seek justice for Eric Garner, Trayvon Martin, Tamir Rice. But then I go back 100 years and I look at the way he used the Guardian to almost viralize social justice campaigns of the day. Could you talk about some of those campaigns and how he literally used the pages of the paper to agitate, raise consciousness, but also raise money?
Yeah, so one of the things I put out in the book is that the role of the Black press, and I think that that is something that scholars now are definitely starting to uncover, but I think it's something that's important to look at. I mean, if it's 1900 and segregation is alive and well, lynching is happening, Ida B. Wells is going around the country trying to protest against lynching, and no major newspaper is covering her in the way that she deserved to be covered. You know, the fact that she was a journalist talking about lynching and really researching what this scourge was in the United States. And so you weren't getting like a press that was doing that. I know we now tend to think, well, she was Ida B. Wells Barnett, she was somehow appreciated in her time, and she really wasn't. So Trotter, the Black press begins in the 1820s, 1827. It became some of the first newspapers to confront slavery, enslavement, and American racism in the North before the Civil War. And Trotter grew up in that tradition. He was astounded that by the time the 1880s came around, the press had fundamentally changed. It had changed where all of the press, including the mainstream white press, was designed to appeal to kind of working people, so a mass market. But the paper itself was distributed by political parties. So the Democratic Party or the Republican Party would like support a newspaper, and that would dictate what then the newspaper stated. If we think of it in today's terms, kind of corporate media, people would say, you know, a corporate entity having a way that they're talking about politics. And Trotter believed that the Black press had to be independent. And therefore, every week, it had to be independent by talking about things that were actually happening in the Black community, using that community as a resource to talk about issues, right? And then put those issues in the newspaper in a way that the public could understand. So his newspaper was like 4 pages long, eventually went to 8, went back to 4. It had pictures, it had cartoons in it. He had an editorial every week, and that was usually the sort of more political side of his, blatantly political side of his writing. But then he would have all of these articles that were talking about what was happening in Southern communities, the rise in racial violence that wasn't merely lynching, it was sort of the violence against Black communities, talking about what was going on locally. So he was a big booster of, you know, in Boston, there was a West Indian Benevolent Association and what the West Indian community was doing. So he was very big on this idea that the Black press had to be independent and it had to reflect what the Black community itself was experiencing, and therefore become like a voice of political radicalism through cultivating the needs and concerns of the Black community.
Just by way of an example, there was a wonderful case, tragic case, about the extradition of a man from North Carolina. Could you just talk about that? Because it just made it so vivid, the ways in which a paper could be used to lift up an individual, a person who's emblematic of a broader social justice challenge.
Okay, so very good. So Monroe Rogers was an African-American young man. He lived in North Carolina. In the 1880s, his family migrated, like many African-Americans from North Carolina and Virginia, to Massachusetts. They lived in a town, a city south of Boston called Brockton. And Monroe Rogers was he was the last of his family to make his way out of North Carolina. And he was working as a farmhand. And he went at the end of the week, like he did every week in 1901, to ask for his pay. And the white farm owner refused to give it to him. So Monroe Rogers got mad, he left. And then mysteriously, the white farm owner's farm, a barn, burned down. And Monroe Rogers immediately became the target of that he had committed this crime. He immediately got on a train, fled to his family in Boston, stayed in Brockton, got a job, was living in Brockton for about 8 or 9 months when the authorities in North Carolina found out where he was and informed the authorities in Massachusetts that he was accused of a crime and he had to be extradited down into North Carolina. Now, at the time, Trotter begins the newspaper in 1901, and Trotter had been cataloging methodically every week the racial violence that was happening in the South. And one of the things he had been following was the fact that in North Carolina at the time, there had been 2 young boys, 14 and 17, who had been arrested for vagrancy. They were put into a jail. The governor, when they were put into jail, had promised they would not be lynched, and instead they were taken from the jail and brutally lynched in public. And so Trotter had been following these types of stories that were taking place across the country, mostly in the South. And he immediately contacted an attorney saying that Monroe Rogers should not be extradited, that if you extradite Monroe Rogers, it was fundamentally sending him to have not have his due day in court, and it was violating rights underneath the 14th Amendment to equal protection under the law. So Trotter used the Guardian. He not only published Monroe Rogers' case, but I say in the book that he published images of Monroe Rogers. So at a time when a lot of these cases were seen as faceless, Black people being brutally murdered in public, right? And you didn't really see their faces. Trotter gets an image and puts it on the cover of the Guardian. And every week he would have readers write in with donations to support a defense fund for Rogers. And we have to think that this is in 1902. So the average age of African Americans, particularly in Boston, is abysmally low, right? And people were donating things. And every week, to make this a community project, he would post what people had donated for. So everyone from donating like a penny to like 5 pennies. And it'd say, Mrs. Jones in Dorchester donated 4 pennies. This church donated $1, right? And slowly they gain a fund. And through that, they hire 2 attorneys. His old friend from Harvard Law School, who went to Harvard Law School, William Henry Lewis, and another Harvard graduate named Clement Morgan, both Black men, and they took his case. And they argued it before the governor of Massachusetts that Monroe Rogers should not be transported because he was not guaranteed that his life would not be in danger. And so Trotter was publicizing this case. He's not just publicizing the case, but he was urging people to show up in meetings with the governor. So there's images in the newspapers of trainloads of Black people from Woburn and from Cambridge and from out in the suburbs getting on the train and coming to downtown Boston and approaching the governor, standing outside with Trotter as he's arguing the case before the governor. And the governor, to the governor's credit, has the case investigated through the Attorney General of Massachusetts in 1902. And they're discussing the case, right? They're meeting with Trotter, they're meeting with these Black attorneys. And in the midst of all of this, Booker T. Washington, the most powerful Black man at the time, contacted the governor of North Carolina. The governor of North Carolina says, well, what should I do? This is becoming a scandal. And Booker T. Washington, as I detail in the book, basically says, we'll just put him on a train and bring him back down south. This isn't really a problem. This is not the racial issue that Negroes are concerned with. And so the authorities, when they're transporting Monroe Rogers from the jail in Boston, put him on a train, send him to North Carolina, where he's put into prison. He dies in solitary confinement a few years later of septic poisoning. And it comes out in the trial, the course of this story, that Monroe Rogers actually was not guilty, that the barn actually caught on fire during a thunderstorm, that it was not set by a human being. So Trotter uses this case like as a rallying cry for the community. And one of the things I point out in his use of the newspaper is really using phrasing, using rhetoric to tell African-American people that this was their fight, right? That this was their business, that they were the ones who could raise and donate money, albeit small, to pay for his defense. and that they were the people who needed to help decide his fate because the legal system was not going to do that. And this was one of the many actions that Monroe Trotter does in the early 1900s that ended up bringing this populist bent to his activism. You know, people from Kansas and Omaha and Virginia and Cleveland writing to his newspaper over the years, talking about how they used the newspaper to galvanize, to organize their own community, and that they had not been used to seeing that. Somebody who was a Black man who was so bold to approach, to demand justice, and to use Black people to demand it with him.
So now, when you talked about a Black man being so bold, right? So, you know, Trotter, to the extent that people understand him, is often viewed as controversial and confrontational, right? And there's a wonderful, colorful incident in the book that, for me, invoked many of the marches and demonstrations I've been to, where you hear people say, "Shut it down." So, if you can describe, paint a picture, if you will, for folks about this confrontation between Trotter and Washington.
So Booker T. Washington, again, was the most powerful Black man in the country at the time. Had an inspiring story of rising up literally from slavery, entering Hampton Institute, then going down into Tuskegee, Alabama, and basically creating Tuskegee Institute from scratch, right? And Booker T. Washington, in that, as I say in the book, was somebody who was brought up in that tradition. And it was brought up in kind of the violence, the terror that was inflicted upon Black people in the South during and after Reconstruction. And so when he went and founded Tuskegee Institute, he did that with a very single purpose in mind: to give the Black formerly enslaved people an education that would be subsidized by support from white philanthropists. And so Booker T. Washington, and Du Bois said this as well. Du Bois commented on Washington that it was unfortunate that Washington was a leader of two races and not one, right? So that everything Washington did, he had to go through white gatekeepers in order to get his school off the ground, to get and protect the students at his university. So when Booker T. Washington his star was rising in the late 1890s, this was one of the things that disturbed Trotter, because Trotter's argument was that Washington was not the chosen leader of Black communities, right? That neither he nor Du Bois, and he would call them imported Benedict Arnolds of the Negro race, basically that they were people who did not have the interests of average Black people in mind. Because Trotter would say, and I say this in the book, they couldn't, right? Because their job was to make sure that the school was running, Tuskegee was running, and that the people who went there were safe and were getting the education that was prescribed there. So Trotter's vision was that Booker T. Washington was dishonest, that he often talked to white philanthropists and white sponsors of Tuskegee in a way that confirmed all the stereotypes that white America had of Black people. That, for instance, Reconstruction was a mistake, that Black people didn't need to vote because they needed to concentrate on education, and that if Black people just earned a living, earned their own money, got a skill, that they would be able to, that racism would go away. And we kind of hear that now today as well. Like if Black people just, go to Harvard or go to Spelman or go to Morehouse and put their nose to the grindstone, racism will go away. And that was definitely the rhetoric that Trotter saw in Booker T. Washington. And so in 1903, Booker T. Washington was head of something called the Afro-American Council, which was supposed to be a political organization, as well as one that was supposed to be addressing, quote unquote, the Negro problem. And Trotter really saw this organization as merely becoming a mouthpiece for Booker T. Washington and Tuskegee. In other words, that Booker T. Washington, we now know, was going to Black newspapers, purchasing them, and basically controlling the opinions of the public about what was happening in Black America, right? And so when summer of 1903, Booker T. Washington came to give us a speech for the National Negro Business League in Boston, which Trotter was also very critical of. Trotter arguing that the Negro does not need another business organization. What we need is justice, right? And so when Washington came to speak, Monroe Trotter had issued 11 questions that he wanted to ask Washington. One of them being, is the rope and the lash the only thing that Negroes can expect under your leadership? Goes to ask these questions. Booker T. Washington got Trotter expelled from the church in Boston. He comes back. Eventually there was what was referred to as the Boston Riot. I say in the book that it's kind of blown out of proportion by Washington, who uses this to say, look at what's going on with the Black people in Boston. They're unruly. Trotter served 30 days in jail for disrupting the peace. Booker T. Washington then tried to buy out the Guardian so he could, as he said, squelch Black people's dissent, and Trotter comes back stronger than ever and continues to publish the Guardian. So incidents like that, right, are incidents that Trotter throughout his life continues to have. And you say confrontational. And one of the things I say in the beginning in the introduction to the book is that we tend to think that the act of Black people being confrontational in the face of injustice, that even today, we think of that as an outrage, right? How dare you, as people who are being abused or denied certain forms of justice, be angry, for instance, or be confrontational, right? And so Trotter confronted that at his time, but at a time when it really was considered, why would you, as a Black man, talk about another Black man in public, right? And Booker T. Washington is doing things for the race, quote unquote. How dare you confront him on his record, right? And so Trotter very boldly saying that, number one, Black people needed to be outraged. They needed to be confrontational, right? His favorite thing was, agitate, agitate, agitate. That was the statement that he said, right? Racism, segregation, injustice wasn't going to go away because, as he said, the white man believes that it needs to go away. It will only go away if it's forced to, right? You can't count on the goodwill of people. So confrontation was definitely his style.
How is it that Frederick Douglass said that power concedes nothing without the man? And we regard him as a great orator, but William Monroe Trotter confronts Washington. He confronts him as a matter of integrity. He confronts the racial accommodationism, and somehow he's seen as controversial and confrontational. Now, maybe perhaps that has something to do with the modest ways in which he engaged President Woodrow Wilson. You can that.
Okay, so Woodrow Wilson ran for president in 1912. He ran for president at a time when the rhetoric surrounding African-American people was that Black people were Republicans, that they were loyal to the party of Lincoln. And Trotter had grown up in a household where his own father, James Monroe Trotter, very early on said that Black people had to be independent, that the party of Lincoln had betrayed its original promise of radical Reconstruction, and that Black people had to ally themselves with something different, right? And that the only obligation they had was to have a race-first approach to politics. So that's the household under which Trotter grew up. And so Trotter, by the early 1900s, the Republican Party was the party that, again, was founded in the 1850s. It's the party of Lincoln. But by the early 1900s, really that party had shifted its focus, right? And I go a lot into the book on how that had developed, and historians have been studying this. The party had really shifted to looking at laissez-faire economic policy, the idea that, social Darwinist view of racism and race, that basically what needed to happen was Black people needed to be, taught, and they needed to have a level of cultural and personal propriety, and then, they could get the rights that they were promised at the end of the Civil War. And so Trotter grows up under this environment, but by the 1912, when Woodrow Wilson was running for president, Trotter had various campaigns where he had pushed Northern Black people who could still vote. So Trotter was very cognizant of the fact that by 1900, most Southern states, if not all Southern states, had laws that denied Black people the right to vote, right? In the North, that hadn't yet happened. And so his argument was, look, Black people in the North, even though we are a numerical minority, we can sway elections, right?
Right.
We are the deciding vote in Boston, in New York, in Cleveland, in Chicago, even though we're told that our numbers are small, right? And so we can swing an election, and that's our time to argue for things we want, whether the person we're arguing with is Democrat or Republican, right? And so in 1912, he organizes and argues that Black people have been so betrayed by the Republican Party. Specifically, he points to the treatment of Black soldiers in Brownsville, Texas, by the Roosevelt administration. He says, we've been treated so poorly, we are going to rally around something new. And so he enters 1912 saying, well, there's Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson, as I point out in the book, had not yet served on a national stage, right? And had been known and was known as being a progressive. And I take to task in the book what progressivism meant at the time. And so Woodrow Wilson could very realistically be seen as a progressive in terms of his approach to the economy and politics and that type of thing. But he was an avowed white supremacist, right? Trotter urged Black people to vote for Wilson, and they did. So 1912 was the first year that many Black communities in the North where they could vote turned out for Wilson, so the first time. And Trotter basically goes to Wilson before Wilson is elected, and Wilson, for the first time as a sitting or a soon-to-be president, meets with Trotter and a delegation of Black men who basically tell him, this is what we want. And Wilson says, well, I don't know if I agree with you, but I will consult your concerns. So Trotter is ecstatic. W.E.B. Du Bois, by the way, also argued that Blacks should vote for Wilson. Wilson, as we now know historically, entered the White House in 1913 with a mandate from white supremacists across the South, particularly from states like Texas and Alabama, in which they argued that the first thing that had to happen was that Black people had to be ousted from the federal government. Right? That Black people who at the time the federal government was the kind of saving institution of the Black middle class in DC, where Black people were appointed to various offices and those offices were not segregated, right? And there's this call that they should be. And so with that, Wilson, by the end of his first year as president, segregates the United States government. And with that, many Black people, particularly the Black middle class, right, lose their jobs, or if they had kept their jobs, were denied advancement in the federal government. And Trotter approached Woodrow Wilson twice, both of which times he basically confronted him on the policies that were affecting African-American people. And what I point out in that book, what's so phenomenal about that moment, is that he approaches him in a way that we don't even really see activists doing today, which is when you go up to the president and you confront them on their record, right? You said this is what you were going to do, Mr. President, right? And this is instead what we've gotten. And what is your response, right? And so Woodrow Wilson basically is flustered, basically tells him, you know, I'm not going to talk if this Black person is talking to me in the office, and he's kicked out of the office. But what that did, and I say in the book, is that it was a very powerful moment for Trotter's supporters, working class, poorer Black people, right? That, you know, you voted for somebody, that somebody ended up betraying the things that you assumed they would do. And particularly as Black people whose vote is so precious at the time, you had the right to confront that person, right? And Trotter, I argue in the book, probably was not going in there thinking that Wilson is gonna suddenly change his mind. He's more saying, you know, this is our right as a citizen, right? How dare you take for granted the vote that we've given you to get into office? And there's evidence that, you know, Wilson would not have won in northern cities if Black populations had not shifted as they had, right? So he's really confronting this shift in politics. So another sort of moment in his career.
It's just a powerful moment. He further endeared himself with people all across the country because his militancy was really about accountability. So we have a great many people who would love to pose questions to you, Professor.
Wonderful, thank you.
So Devin.
Absolutely. This has been a tremendous conversation. I'm just learning so much. You've captured in this short moment the width and the breadth of Trotter's life. So thank you so much. We have some questions from our audience. So one comes from Tessa Kaneen. Tessa asks, she says there's clearly so much to learn from the work of Trotter and the challenges he faces. But could you summarize how the activists of today can learn from Trotter and the struggles he confronted?
Mm-hmm.
That's a good question, and thank you for asking it. I would say that one of the things I think that all of us need to know, and this isn't sort of, I hesitate to say I'm telling, like waving my finger and telling people this is how you should do it. I think all of us should remember is that struggles for justice don't just suddenly happen, right? It's not as if your struggle for justice is that there's going to be a moment where the powers that be suddenly say, oh my goodness, you were correct, right? And here you go, right? Which is what Frederick Douglass meant by it doesn't concede without being agitated, right?
Right.
And so that means that every moment of protest should be predicated on the fact that there's going to be another moment of protest that comes after it, right? That the agitation itself, I think what we learned from Trotter is the lesson, right? Until there is no, the systems that you're protesting against give in. And because the way that systems work, as Trotter would, very presciently realize, it's not just going to be one day there's no more racism, or one day Woodrow Wilson was going to understand the power of his rhetoric in unleashing violence on the country, right? But what was going to happen was that there's going to be the people themselves are going to keep agitating and agitating so that they can get some type of justice. And he was not somebody by the end of his life who believed that electoral politics was the only answer, as I talk about in the book. But he did believe that if you live in what was professed to be a democracy, and Black people were denied the right to vote, that one of their goals, of many goals, had to be that they exercise their right where they could, right, to change legislation, right? And that was the most direct way in a professed democracy that could happen. Now, towards the end of his life, he was definitely somebody, he found something called the African Blood Brotherhood, in which he advocated that Black communities arm themselves against white mobs. He was somebody who believed, flirted with socialism and communism and Black nationalism as well. But he fundamentally believed that, and I think the lesson is that agitation for justice, particularly racial justice, cannot be looked at as something that we have this one protest and things change. Because what you're up against are systems of power that are not going to change unless they are absolutely forced to. And so it's making them be forced to do so at that moment.
Absolutely. And I'd also like to pose this next question to both of you, Professor Brooks and Professor Greenidge. We have a question from Kasim Kelly. She asked, how can we apply Trotter's organizational strategies in Wilson's election to the upcoming presidential election, especially given what we saw today in Wisconsin?
Professor, I hear from you. You're the author here.
I think mobilize where we can, right? What happened today in Wisconsin is just the lines of people having to go and vote during a national or international, transnational pandemic at 5 polling places. I guess were open when there used to be, hundreds of them in one place. That is unconscionable. One of the things that needs to happen immediately is that there needs to be people mobilizing people to exercise the rights that they do have, right? Mobilizing all the great work that voting rights activists are doing as we're talking here, are doing to mobilize communities to get out the vote, to make sure that as the election year comes down, that what we have is, and where we can, get people elected to office. But I would also say that we're at a moment that we need to focus on getting out the vote. Everyone needs to vote, but we also need to realize that we are at a moment of fundamental crisis, much like Trotter was in his time. So the crisis being in Trotter's time that you have the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment that were completely ignored, right? Much like now, the 14th and 15th Amendment with rulings against the Voting Rights Act of 1964 have been eroded. And so we need to concentrate immediately on getting the people who are presently in office out of office, right? That's the fundamental thing. But we also need to concentrate on the fact that the system under which we live in a democracy, right, is fundamentally in a moment where we're in a moment of crisis. And so just whatever happens in November, that can't be the end of whatever it is where we are now, right? If we get a new administration, it can't be the end that, oh my goodness, great, everything is fine, now let's go back to status quo. If we don't get a new administration, oh my gosh, this is, there's nothing we can do here, right? Because there is stuff, and there is mobilization going on amongst younger people, particularly amongst communities that aren't getting press. So, local Black, brown, disenfranchised communities that have people who are mobilizing and organizing. And so it's important that we keep that the struggle in those places.
So one thing I would just footnote to what you said, based upon what you so wonderfully wrote, is that Trotter early on emphasizes race first as opposed to party first. And so putting the interests of real people first, number one. Number two, his own sense of personal integrity, right? In other words, not being bought off or tolerating those who would be bought off. There's corruption in high places. Number three, the range and diversity of the tools that he used. As a student, pressing a sitting governor, pushing for legislation, engaging in policy, but also using advocacy to precipitate litigation and using the legal means. Number three, and number three here, is not being afraid to communicate to regular people in terms that people understand and that they can connect to. So I would argue he's first Twitter radical.
Yes, I think I like that. I like that you say that. I remember my publisher, wonderful people at Norton, were like, "Oh, when you're doing the introduction, you have to make it real for people." And I was like, "Is it too far? Am I like getting rid of my historian's card by saying he's doing like what a Twitter activist would do?" And I mean, as I started to think about it, I was like, actually, no, using the press and a public platform in creative ways so that people know what's actually going on, number one, and that the record of the historical moment is kept, right? Because one of the things Trotter was saying is that you could have a horrendous piece of racial violence happen, and much like now, it's just not talked about in the press, but the community itself knew it was being there. And that was his mantra. The community itself has to be the record and stand witness.
And it didn't make him any less thoughtful or analytical, ranking 3 in his class and being Phi Beta Kappa, to communicate in terms that most folks understand. So Devin, another question?
We have one more question, and I think that we have time for this one last question. So this is from Jim McQueenie. Jim asks, which civil rights leader today most exemplifies the style and spirit of Trotter?
Well, I'm always asked that. And I always say that I don't think there's anybody on a national and transnational scale. So Trotter had a lot of clout amongst Caribbean people, amongst the transnational Black working class, those that he engaged. So I don't think there's anybody who's akin to that now. I think when we ask that question of ourselves, we should ask how, as individuals, we can try to be more like him. And I'm very critical of him in the book, right? I say that, he was a misogynist, and he was, disorganized, and he was often very hard to get along with. But I mean, one of the things that he was able to do was do what you were saying, Professor Brooks, really do the work of working within the community itself where it was, right? And saying that community had the wisdom to basically organize itself, that those communities know what they need. They know they need the right to vote, right? They know they need these things, and to listen to what it is that they're saying, and then mobilize through that, right? To get the justice they deserve.
But I think Mr. McQueenie's question really also speaks to something you do in the book, which is you situate Trotter in this almost a familial lineage of social justice, from King to Du Bois to Trotter to Frederick Douglass. You situate him. So as you describe him on the cover, a Black radical, where does he fit in the radical tradition? If you can close out on that and speak to the folks today who don't call themselves radicals, but who are in need of a little inspiration in terms of the quest for social justice?
Radical, he's a Black radical because he fundamentally believed that justice was the goal of protest, that it wasn't merely a matter of changing laws, although changing those laws would get to justice, but the justice itself was the ultimate goal, and that African American people had been had earned the right to be citizens, had earned the right to have equal protection under the law, had earned the right to be able to decide and engage in economics and politics on an equal level, but also on a level that was not exploitative. And so his idea was that justice was the goal, right? And so I think that as activists, as people who might not see themselves as radicals, if that's the ultimate goal, and justice very far-reaching, right? And not just window dressing, right? That's really what he was talking about, was that there needed to be moments of justice and reckoning, right? And that the people themselves were the people who would decide on what terms that justice would look like.
And I just can't help but this is on the heart. On this, the 147th anniversary of his birth, what would you say to literally a generation of activists who are looking back over their shoulders at the activists of the past, looking into the future in terms of the next generation to come, drawing from this book and drawing from Trotter's legacy? What would you say to them on this his birthday?
I would say realize that we are all part of this long tradition of Black protest and Black radical attempts to dismantle the racial, economic, and political system that currently exists. And so if you take that that's what you are part of, that you are merely somebody who is the 2020 incarnation of what has happened before you, then that's the way to approach all justice work, is that you're merely stepping in the footsteps of people who came before, just as Trotter would say he came in the footsteps of David Walker and Frederick Douglass and his father.
Well, Professor Greenidge, I just want to extend a word of appreciation to you for writing a phenomenal book. One of my colleagues came by my office, a person you may know, David Gergen.
Yes.
Said, "You got to read this." And I'd already been anticipating the book. And I just want to commend to our viewers and listeners that this is a powerful, powerful book. And I was not asked to advertise and promote, but I'm promoting and advertising. Please read Black Radical. I want to also thank our colleagues at the Institute of Politics, the Center for Public Leadership at the Kennedy School, our production staff, our staff director, Devin Crawford, our program coordinator, Kathleen Schneid, Reem Ali, Kanisha Johnson, Cassine Kelly, Tessa Kaneen, Mahalia Mathalia, Malachi Robinson, and all the people across the country who tuned in to listen to this extraordinary conversation. Thank you. Follow the William Monroe Trotter Collaborative on social media. Participate and partake of our work. And we look forward to the next podcast of the Avant Guardian. So with that,
thank you so much for having me, Professor Brooks.
Oh, thank you. Wonderful. Read the book, buy the book.
Thank you.
Take care.